Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, the visible and the invisible, this is chapter 7. This is part 7 of not chapter 7, it's part 7 of this series. We're in the second chapter, interrogation and dialectic, and still in the first part of this chapter, perceptual faith and negativity. So here in this video, basically we're going to work through those same three aspects, or the framework of this video is the same as it was in the last video. Those three aspects of being, going to the things for me, to the things for others, and to the things themselves. That framework that I talked about in the last video. We're going to continue. We're going to revisit that framework, but in this video we're going to look at pure vision through that framework. So we're going to look at how vision appears if we think of the subject as pure nothingness and the world as pure being. See what we get, see how that picture is deficient according to Merleau-Ponty. So there is a little bit of repetition in this video. That we do go over some of the same arguments and the same points, but kind of coming at them from a different perspective, which always helps to clarify. It always helps to go over the same thing again, but using slightly different words or approaching it from a different angle, like we are now. In this video, we'll look at this nothingness versus pure being from the perspective of vision. And so I think we do get some value, even though there is a bit of repetition here. So the first part of the video is the world for me, pure vision. So in vision, we look at the world from an invisible retreat, or in fact from pure vision. Pure because it's nothing, we are nothing but vision. We are nothingness but vision. So the subject is that nothingness. So when we think about vision, there is this invisible opening point. Vision appears from this invisible perspective because the perspective is literally a nothingness. And this, Merleau-Ponty says, is absolutely true. This is right. Vision does appear in vision, the world is revealed from an invisible retreat. But he asks, is this necessarily the whole truth? And can one then formulate it by saying that there is in the in itself as position, that there is the in itself as position, and that the for itself in exists as negation? In other words, is the best explanation of this, the best way to understand vision, to posit an existing in itself as pure being and a negative for itself which inexists and which only brings a sense of negation to being and thereby allowing there to be anything. So there are problems with that, as you would expect, and as we talked about in the last couple of videos. First, or in the last video I should say, first it's abstract. This gives us a very abstract way of understanding vision. And second, Merleau-Ponty says it would actually render vision impossible. And this is because being itself would never be apprehended as it is, because it would always be interiorized, degraded into mere spectacle, i.e. degraded into something for me. We would never come to understand being itself, because every time we see it, all we're seeing is being adulterated by my own perspective. So being in itself as a totality is never graspable. But also nothingness would be lost because it would be entirely pledged to being. So in the way that we talked about before, nothingness, the lack in nothingness, the fissures in nothingness are filled by being. So nothingness itself ends up disappearing. So the consequence of this, then, we have a nothingness which is filled with being, and a being that is emptied by nothingness, a destruction of each by the other. So there's no sense in which we can say there is vision taking place here, because there's actually no encounter between anything, because the for itself is nothing, that can't encounter anything, and being itself isn't encountering anything, because, as we said, the for itself is nothing to encounter. And so both end up cancelling each other out, and the very idea of vision itself kind of breaks down. To avoid this, being and nothingness can't be exterior relations, Merleau-Ponty says. So they can't be there can't be a relation of exteriority between being and nothingness, such that being is something over here and nothingness is this other non-thing over here, and they interact. That picture doesn't make sense. There can't be that kind of exterior relation between them. So what happens is that we try to achieve vision or understand vision by thinking of it as nihilation. And that is what Sartre does in Being and Nothingness. Nihilation is how this process plays out. And so what nihilation does is it modifies vision in that it makes the in itself pass to the status of a world seen, and makes the for itself pass to the status of a for itself sunken into being, situated, incarnated. So we don't have a negation confronting a positivity. We don't have nothingness encountering being. Rather, we have a negation that sinks into a positivity, and a positivity that is only insofar as it is not the emptiness that emerges within it. So we get this more tightly interconnected relation, and that's in opposition to this idea of an exterior relation where two things can be related to each other, two things that are different can be related to each other through a relation that is external to both of them. Rather, what we have with this idea of nihilation is that the relation is interior to them. Being is what it is only through the nothingness that has sunken into it. So on their own, they're nothing. Not nothingness. They're on their own. They don't even exist. They have no... Even trying to talk about them on their own doesn't make sense. In actual fact, they are a totality. And that's what Merleau-Ponty means when he says they are abstractions. They only make sense... it only makes sense to consider them separately if we're talking in abstract terms, because in actual fact they are a totality. They are one and the same. However, Merleau-Ponty says this still doesn't resolve the fundamental opposition. To see is to not be, and what is seen is being. In that case, vision would be an immediate presence to the world. But the question remains, how could the nothingness I am be separated from being such that it could be immediate presence, such that we could talk of vision as immediate presence? If it is, either what we have is an idealism, so the for itself is not non-being, rather in some way it is all of being. Being is just the for itself. And this doesn't give us the preconstitutive being that we're looking for. We're looking for being prior to any kind of constituting action. If this is an idealism, then it already presupposes something. It already presupposes a for itself, a mind of some sort, something from which being can emerge. So either it's an idealism or it's something else. It's something else which is not idealism and is kind of undefined. But even in this case, even if we grant that there is this other alternative to idealism, then there are still problems. And they're the same problems we've seen before. The for itself is no longer pure non-being. To see is no longer simply to annihilate. The relation between what I see and I who see is not one of immediate or frontal contradiction. The things attract my look. My gaze caresses the things. It espouses their contours and their reliefs. Between it and them, we catch sight of a complicity. So there is this relation between the seeing and the thing seen that goes beyond just mere annihilation, just beyond a mere negation. There's an active force here that can't be explained by nothingness, by a force which simply annihilates. As Merleau-Ponty says, the things attract my look, my gaze caresses them. It espouses their contours and reliefs. This is a more engaging and engaged process than simply annihilation, than simply pure being finding itself opposed frontally by a contradicting force. There's a closer, more intimate, if you like, relation between the two. So the for itself, and in other words, we have to go beyond thinking of the for itself as merely a negating force, as annihilating force. But also, being is no longer pure plenitude, because if the for itself is mere annihilation, it can't account for the negative properties in the world. The for itself, as a negating force, can only be a negating force. It can only negate. It can't have this more subtle interaction. It can't negate in shades, to varying degrees. It can't negate such that we see things like we talked about in the last video, depth, possibilities, those kinds of shades of negations require something more than just annihilating force. There has to be more to it than that. So if the for itself is only a negating force, is only annihilation, then we can't understand how there are these gradations of being in the world. And in that case, without the for itself bringing those to the picture, then we have to assume that being itself has those degrees of non-being in it. And we need those, right? We need to have those shades of being, because without them, there would be nothing to be seen in the first place. If it was either all negated or nothing was negated, in either of those cases, if it's that all or nothing situation, then there is no vision itself. If either everything is pure plenitude or everything is pure negation, then there is nothing. We don't get any. There is no sense in which vision can. There's nothing to be seen, right? If it's one of those extremes, vision takes place in the middle, in the blend, in the give and take of being, if you like, the the emergence of possibilities and depth and partial being, things seeming more real, something seeming to have more being than other things, to have more concreteness to them than other things. That's where vision it's in that zone where vision takes place. The negations, the perspective deformations, the possibilities, which I have learned to consider as extrinsic denominations, I must now reintegrate into being, which therefore is staggered out in depth, conceals itself at the same time that it discloses itself, is abyss and not plenitude. So like I said, being becomes infused with non-being. So being is no longer pure plenitude. And the conclusion then of this little section is that vision is not the immediate relationship of the for itself with the in itself. And we are invited to redefine the seer as well as the world seen. The analytic of being and nothingness is the seer who forgets that he has a body, and that what he sees is always beneath what he sees, who tries to force the passage toward pure being and pure nothingness by installing himself in pure vision, who makes himself a visionary, but who is thrown back to his own opacity as a seer and to the depth of being. I really like that quote, actually. I've read it a few times now, and each time I read it, it seems to come alive in a slightly different way. And finally now I feel like when I first read it, it was a little bit opaque, but the more I read it, the more I like it. So vision is not a relationship between a thing and another thing, or a thing and a no thing, an X and a Y. Rather, we have to redefine the seer and the world seen. So Merleau-Ponty is saying that Sartre forgets the for itself has a body. It is concretely, opaquely in the world, not this total nothingness. And on the other side, he forgets that the world itself is full of fissures. It's full of, as he says, depths that the for itself doesn't see, because it's those depths which make the seen visible in the first place. This is where he says the world is always beneath what he sees. The world is always this, it's full of depths that we don't see, because those very things that we don't see are what make the seen in the first place. They would give us, they would provide something to be seen in the first place. Without those depths of non-being, there would be nothing. There is nothing to be seen. And so the long and the short of it is that vision can't be properly explained or understood as an encounter between a pure negation or a pure nothingness and a pure positivity, pure being. The connection is deeper than that. So let's turn to the second part of the video, which is the other pure vision. Okay, so installed in pure vision, as we're assuming ourselves to be a pure nothingness, pure nothingnesses, and seeing how vision makes sense, or if it can make sense with that assumption, then there can be no encounter with another, for the look dominates. It can dominate only things, and if it falls upon men, it transforms them into puppets which move only by springs. The other can enter into the universe of the seer only by assault, as a pain and a catastrophe. He will rise up not before the seer in the spectacle, but laterally as a radical casting into question of the seer. Since he is only pure vision, the seer cannot encounter an other who thereby would be a thing seen. If he leaves himself, it will only be by a turning back of the vision upon himself. If he finds an other, it will only be as his own being seen. So as pure vision, as a vision which is nothingness, which comes from a nothingness, instead of the other, we encounter either a thing seen, a puppet, or an object in Sartre's vernacular, or my own being seen, that is to say, a subject. We encounter a subject, something that turns us into an object. A radical casting into question of me and my world, as Sartre might have put it, a sinkhole of meaning. So we never encounter the other in a genuine sense. We either encounter a puppet or we encounter our own being seen by some unknown agency. Another problem with this claim is that another problem with trying to understand the other from this perspective of pure vision is that the claim is being made as a general truth, applying not just to me, but to every other person as well. So, and it's moving from that general claim about all people to a specific claim about the way that the other appears for me. So we're describing the situation from the for itself in general and the for the other in general. However, the description itself, when it cashes itself out, confines me to my own experience. That is to say, it's specific and solipsistic. So what happens here, I think this is Merleau-Ponty's point, the ambiguity of the first, the general claim about in which the for itself and other people are nothingnesses, conceals the solipsism of the second, which is a description that focuses on a single instance, my own experience of the other. So I think what Merleau-Ponty's saying here is that this actually doesn't make sense, this conception, but the fact that it doesn't make sense is being concealed from us because there's a movement taking place from the general, where we're given this way of understanding ourselves and other people as nothingnesses, and moving where if we remained at that level, we'd see the way that it can't conform to our actual experience, but then we slip down to a specific example of our experience, and then we can describe that experience at this more particular level, and it kind of makes sense. But if we remained up here at the general level, we would see that this is not really there is a contradiction here. There is no genuine encounter. But when we as soon as we start to talk about a genuine encounter, we slip down to this particular case, the case where I encounter a specific other. I have this specific feeling of shame, and I get this sense of the other directing this look at me, and so on and so forth, and that all kind of makes sense. But there is this tension between the two levels. We've moved from the general to the particular, and every time Sartre has to explain in one register or the other, he's able to switch between the two and make it seem as if there is no problem. But actually, as Merleau-Ponty is saying here, there is no actual encounter with the other under this. If we think of ourselves, if we think of vision in this pure sense, the vision of a nothingness. And so that's exactly Merleau-Ponty's criticism. The problem is that the visceral reality of other people in our actual experience means that this description is inadequate. We do not have my being for me and my being for the other virtually multiplied to n samples. We have face-to-face my being for myself, the same being for me offered as a spectacle to the other, the gaze of another as bearer of a being for itself, which is a rejoinder of my own, but capable of petrifying my own. And finally, this same being for itself of the other, aimed at and in some way reached, perceived by my gaze upon him. So in other words, instead of reasoning about my experience by thinking through two general terms, which is the contradiction, the for itself and the for the other, Merleau-Ponty is saying there is a four-term system here. My being for me, my being for the other, the for itself of another, and his or her being for me. In other words, the other is simply being accorded genuine reality, not just an unknown incumbent of that zone of the not mine, which I, as Merleau-Ponty says, mark out in dotted lines in being. So there is this more tangible sense of the other that is not accounted for, that can't properly be described in Sartre's system. And the other thing I wanted to say about that quote is maybe if you've read Levinas, you might have thought, there's a little bit of Levinas coming through here. We have the face-to-face my being for myself. Face-to-face, that's for sure Levinas, right? However, Merleau-Ponty is definitely not endorsing Levinas's position just yet, and in a moment we'll see why. So Merleau-Ponty moves on to say it will be claimed that the relationship with the other is a relationship of being, because our experience of them is founded on my being objectified by them. In other words, it's my being that is affected by them. So it's not a relationship of knowing. It's not a relationship between one thing and another thing. It's a relationship of being. It's deeper than that. I know the other because I'm affected in my at the level of my being. This is kind of a parallel with what we saw before with Nihilation, right? That it's not the world for me is not an external. It's not marked by an external relation between me and the world. There's Nihilation is an internal relationship, and this is exactly what we're saying here with regards to the other. There's a relationship of being here. It's not at two things different from each other, understood as external. As it's not two things different from each other and having an external relationship, one thing to the other. Rather, the relationship is deeper than this. There's a relationship of being, because when I know the other, when I encounter the other, I'm affected in my being, in the sense that I'm reduced to an object. So they are affecting me at this deeper level of what I actually am, of my being, not just it's not just a superficial relationship of knowing. I'm not something in myself encountering something else which is in itself. Rather, the way the other encounters me is through what I am. They go directly to what I am, reducing me to an object. But Merleau-Ponty says if the relationship with the other really is a relationship of being, the other must be a genuine for itself. We can't just think of them as he said, a space, an unknown incumbent of that zone of the not mine, which is marked out in dotted lines. They have more tangible. They're more tangible than that. They're more concrete than that. They are an actual, genuine for itself. Further, my status as nothingness must sink into my situation, i.e., I stop being pure negation. I become my situation. I become part of being. So I'm no longer pure nothingness. And also, if my relationship with the other really is a relationship of being, we can't think of ourselves and the other as isolated negations stricken by each other in the midst of our own in selves, in the midst of our own universes, separate universes. Rather, we belong to a system of for itselfs, sensible to one another, such that the one knows the other not only in what he suffers from him, but more generally as a witness who can be challenged because he is also himself accused, because he is not a pure gaze upon pure being any more than I am, because his views and my own are in advance inserted into a system of partial perspectives, referred to one same world in which we coexist and where our views intersect. So a system of for itself, partial perspectives, each partial in the sense that each gives a incomplete view of the whole, because they are a view from within the whole, within being. We refer to the same world in which we coexist. So not two nothingnesses whose solipsistic universes are invaded by an outside force. Rather, we coexist within this same being as partial perspectives. And Merleau-Ponty continues, for the other to be truly the other, it does not suffice and it is not necessary that he be a scourge, a judge himself elevated above all contestation, without place, without relativities, faceless like an obsession and capable of crushing me with a glance into the dust of my world. It is necessary and it suffices that he have the power to decenter me, to oppose his centering to my own, and he can do so only because we are not two nihilations installed in two universes of the in itself, incomparable, but two entries to the same being, each accessible to but one of us, but appearing to the other as practicable by right, because they both belong to the same being. So the other doesn't have to be a judge above all relativities, the way that Sartre portrays the other people as capable of reducing us to an object. So a subject who completely determines me. I become nothing. Not nothing, but I become an object for them in their world. But they do have to be able to decenter me, because we're not two nihilations, but two entries to the same being. A nice expression there, right? Two entries to the same being. Later, Merleau-Ponty says we are moments of the same syntax. Another great expression. So the other thing I wanted to note about that is, again, bringing it back to the Levinas connection. If we thought maybe Merleau-Ponty was taking a leaf out of Levinas's book when he talked about the face-to-face earlier, now we see, I think, with this quote that he is distancing himself from Levinas, right? If it could be that the word judge, the way that Merleau-Ponty uses that's a reference to Levinas, because Levinas talks about the other as judging us from an infinite distance. So a judge that we cannot respond to, because the other is infinitely beyond us. And the reason for that, for Levinas, was that he was kind of caught up with trying to find room, I think, for God in this picture. And God was, well, the other people were kind of serving as a conduit, if you like, for God to be experienced, to become experienceable by us, which meant that other people had to be infinitely elevated above us and beyond us. And that's totally not the picture that Merleau-Ponty is presenting here, right? Other people are not judges elevated above us without relativities, faceless like an obsession. They are a partial perspective on being the same way that I am. We are both caught up in, wrapped up in the same being. We coexist in this same being. So a very different position, a very different take on the other from the one that Levinas gave us. Okay, so that's enough about the other. Let's move into the last part of the video, being as world, pure vision. All right, so what is the world that pure vision or vision opens us out onto? Is this world of being a plenitude full of pure things, identical to themselves and wholly positive, such as it would be if vision was pure, if we were a nothingness which was seeing the world? To explain this, Merleau-Ponty reintroduces the notion of field, bringing this back in. From Phenomenology of Perception, where the idea of a field was quite prominent. So he says there's a field or range to vision. Things at the limit or the horizon appear as a background for nearby things which are open and inexhaustible. So not fixed in a positive plenitude of being, in the way that the vision as pure vision would have us believe. Our lives and our experiences of the world are not describable as the experiences of an absolute nothingness before an absolute being. Rather, every relation between me and being, even vision, even speech, is a carnal relation with the flesh of the world. So here we go. Again, Merleau-Ponty bringing in some nice terminology. Those terms carnal and flesh seem designed, to me anyway, to invoke the notion of a body, i.e. the body of the world. So what we have then is pure being is the horizon, that limit, that background, and between that pure being and myself is this field. And that is the flesh in which the carnal relation takes place. So being as not the horizon, which is pure being, but the system of perspectives that open into it, that open into that horizon, that open into between that horizon and me, in that field. That's where the carnal relation takes place. The actual engagement in being takes place in that field in between the horizon and me. And I think those are nice words to describe that, right? The flesh of the world, a carnal relation taking place there. Merleau-Ponty also talks about that field, that in-between field, the flesh, as an atmosphere, having an atmosphere. The mists and the mists that we call the sensible world or history. That's being. Being is in that intermediate place. So it's not this thing completely removed from us. Pure being, if we're going to use the word, refers to something which is at the limit of this field, is at the border, the horizon of being itself, which is this carnal, fleshly relation. So that's nice. But there are two mistakes, Merleau-Ponty says, that we make before this inextricable involvement in that carnal atmosphere. The first is that we deny it by breaking it up into constituent parts, by breaking it up by my body, my death, and by my freedom. Merleau-Ponty gives us examples of the way that we break up this inextricable involvement. The involvement of men in the world and of men in one another, even if it can be brought about only by means of perceptions and acts, is transversal with respect to the spatial and temporal multiplicity of the actual. So this is not a particularly clear quote, I don't think, but what I think Merleau-Ponty's getting at is basically the idea that we can get lost in the details a little bit. The involvement of men in the world and of men in one another, and kind of failing to see the forest for the trees. Or another way to say this perhaps is that the whole is greater than the sum of its finite parts. So put all of the pieces together, or break the whole up into all of its parts, but if you do that, you don't get the same thing that you were trying to grasp originally, which is the whole, the totality, being. If you break it up into its parts, and try and get the whole by summing all of those parts, putting all of those parts, treating them as individual parts and seeing how they might fit together, you don't get the totality, you don't get the whole, you don't get, in this case, being. You get a kind of distorted picture. So breaking it, as soon as you break it up into constituent parts, you lose the being, the wholeness of being that you were trying to grasp. And he also says, which is another way of saying the same thing, I think, that one cannot judge the powers of life by those of death. So trying to understand the living, dynamic whole by dead parts, by parts that are kind of understood as static and discrete, and then movement is being attributed on top, over and above what they originally are as discrete and static. The dynamism, the life has to be understood as a part of the original, the originary whole. Again, another way of explaining this, I think, that Merleau-Ponty uses, one cannot define life as the sum of forces that resist death, nor define being as the suppression of non-being. So again, this is just about trying to understand the whole by breaking it up into parts. You can't understand this life by looking at all of the little pieces in it that resist death. There's something more to it than this. That's just like a negative picture. It's giving you you're trying to understand something which is positive by breaking it up into individual parts which resist something, which negate something. In this case, death, or in our case, actually, non-being. Trying to understand being by all of the little parts within it that negate non-being. But that will never give you an accurate picture. It gives you a distorted view of the whole. So that's the first way first mistake we make when we try and understand being. We deny it. The other mistake that we make is that we reify it. And that's not a word that Merleau-Ponty uses, but it's a word that I love for this. And I use it myself in slightly different context, but it fits quite nicely here, I think. We reify it by turning it into a transcendental, intemporal order, a system of a priori conditions. So we turn it into something which is more than it really is, if you like, something which has some kind of transcendental, intemporal reality to it. But that's going too far. It's kind of it's the mistake. It's the same mistake of denying, of breaking it up into parts, but inverted. So instead of breaking it up into parts, it's like elevating it into something which is bigger than it really is, turning it into a system of a priori conditions, giving it some kind of transcendental gravitas that also doesn't work as any kind of explanation. It kind of goes too far in that direction. And it again, Merleau-Ponty says, postulates that life is only death nullified because one tries to explain by an outside principle everything in it that exceeds the simple summation of its necessary conditions. So instead of trying to understand, in this case, being, by understanding what's there, by taking what it is, we try and attribute being to an external principle, which we're presupposing, in fact, which we are importing into being. So being is what it is only because there's this a priori principle which makes it the thing that it is, which turns it into this some kind of transcendental, intemporal, it gives us a transcendental explanation. It goes beyond being itself, which, like I said, is just it's the inverse of the mistake of breaking it up into parts. So our openness, Merleau-Ponty says, our openness upon a natural and historical world is neither an illusion, as in the first case, nor an a priori, as in the second case. Rather, it is our involvement in being. Nice. Our openness upon a natural and historical world is our involvement in being. And that being is what Merleau-Ponty is looking to understand in the visible and the invisible. So Sartre tried to express this openness by saying that the for itself is haunted by an imaginary, impossible in itself for itself, a blend of the two. And in this, Merleau-Ponty wants to recognize the solidity of myth, which I take to be a reference to perceptual faith, the solidity of that perceptual faith that we talked about at the beginning of the video, the beginning of the series, which is to say a totality that when one looks at it, breaks up into an intuition of pure being and a neg intuition of nothingness. So in essence, Merleau-Ponty is conceding that Sartre was right, but that the picture that he presented was a picture understood through an abstract lens. So he had the right account, the right picture, but he began his discussion of this picture a little too late. He began his understanding after the totality had already been broken up into these two abstract parts, a nothingness and a pure being. So it's kind of like the way I see this. Sartre had the right overall understanding. So he grasped the picture in the right way, but when he tried to explain it, he looked at the picture too closely. And when you look at that picture, being, too closely, it breaks up into these abstract parts, negation and positivity. And that's what Sartre described. And Merleau-Ponty's just saying Sartre just went a little bit too far. If instead of looking at being, he kind of tried to approach it without that invasive gaze, if he tried to step back and maybe let his vision diffuse, if you like, a little bit over the whole, rather than trying to see things. He tried to see things too clearly, perhaps. It's the best way to describe it. Sartre tried to understand being too clearly. So he looked at it too closely. And when you look at being too closely, it breaks apart into a nothingness and a positivity. And what Merleau-Ponty's trying to do is kind of step back and let his vision defocus a little bit so he can see the whole without getting sucked into the situation where being breaks apart. Then you can see and present the whole prior to this abstract division that results. And that's actually quite a good way to put it, I think. I only just thought of that now as I was talking about it, but it is what I was going to say a little bit later, that Merleau-Ponty's criticisms, I think, of Sartre, in a way they take Sartre a little bit too seriously. They treat his philosophy as, and I was going to say this, I'll just mention it now, I might still talk about it later, but they kind of approach his ontology as if it were a metaphysics. So Sartre's picture is an ontological one, a phenomenological one, in which he talks about pure nothingness and pure being, but he's not making metaphysical claims with that, right? He's not saying there is this nothingness thing or this nothingness non-thing. There isn't this inexistent nothingness and an existent positive being over here, which then interact in some way. That would be a metaphysical picture. It would be to turn nothingness and the positivity into substance. But that's not what Sartre was doing, right? Sartre was giving, so it wasn't metaphysical, it was ontological. He was describing experience, how it is, how we actually experience it, without trying to give a metaphysical picture of reality, without trying to tell us this is the way the universe actually is. This is the way, the fundamental nature of reality. He wasn't talking about that. He was just capturing experience through these, in a way, they're almost metaphors, these metaphors of a nothingness and a pure being, which he acknowledges are abstract if you consider them on their own. There is only this totality. And the picture that he was giving, I think, is 100% valid. And in a way, Merleau-Ponty is recognizing that, I think. And all of his criticisms of Sartre kind of treat his ontology as if it were a metaphysical picture. Having said that, of course, the criticisms are, in a way, correct, because Merleau-Ponty wants to understand the totality prior to it being broken apart into negation and a positivity. However, both I think are valid. I think both pictures are valid. I feel like Sartre does sometimes get a bit of a raw deal when he's treated as having done not much more than Descartes did, breaking the world up into two parts. He just put different words, just applied different terms to them instead of mind and extended matter. He said for itself and in itself, but that's very unfair for sure, because Descartes' picture was metaphysical. Sartre's picture was never intended to be metaphysical. It was always phenomenological / ontological, and understood in that way, he was right. And his picture is revealing, and there are a lot of insights, I think, to be gained from thinking of our engagement with being in that way. But Merleau-Ponty is also right in that perhaps we can see being itself without having to break it apart. There's a different perspective we can bring, which will give us the totality in a different way than, or prior to Sartre's picture, which divided it into two. Okay, that's probably enough of that. Let's look at a summary. So first up, we had the world for me, pure vision. And here we said that we look at the world from an invisible retreat. And this is fine. Merleau-Ponty agrees with this. This is how vision presents the world to us. However, being and nothingness cannot be exterior relations. They can't be related in an exterior fashion. One kind of independent thing in relation to another discrete independent thing. Otherwise, you get a nothingness which is filled with being and a being that is emptied by nothingness. So to avoid this, we talked about nihilation, in which the in itself appeared as world seen and the for itself as sunken into being. And so this is not bad. This is quite kind of accurate, right? It gives us a sense of a totality where there isn't a negation over here and a positivity over here encountering each other. Rather, we have this just a totality in which there's annihilating force operating, and that picture isn't bad, but it kind of gets to the right answer in Merleau-Ponty's way of thinking by following the wrong path. And that wrong path is by positing a pure negation and a pure plenitude. And so we end up contradicting ourselves, because the for itself is not pure non-being, and being is not pure plenitude. And that's because I am concretely in the world. We talked about, remember, things attracting my look, my gaze caressing the things. I am completely engaged in the world, concretely, opaquely a part of the world. And on the other hand, being itself is infused with non-being. It's infused with those negations, perspectival deformations, possibilities, and so on and so forth. And so that's the picture that's the problem Merleau-Ponty has with this. The for itself is not non-being, and being is not pure plenitude. So yeah, we get the right kind of picture at the end, but we got there by positing something which doesn't actually exist. The second part of the video, the other, pure vision. And here we saw there is no genuine encounter with the other. Either we see an object like a puppet, or we see ourselves affected, reduced to objects by this external assault upon us. And this, Merleau-Ponty thinks, fails to account for the actual nature of the experience of the other. And so to kind of get around that, the claim then is that pure vision gives us a relationship of being with the other. So our experience of the other is founded on my being objectified, there being an effect on my being itself, the being that I am, rather than just a kind of external knowledge, a kind of external relation grounded in knowledge. The problem for Merleau-Ponty is that if this relationship is really founded on being, the other would be a genuine for itself, and neither of us could be isolated negations. And again, that's just goes to Merleau-Ponty's overall point that the other and myself we coexist within the same being. And the last part of the video, being as world, pure vision. So vision, Merleau-Ponty sees vision as a field here. He talks about vision as a field. So there's a limit or a horizon, and this is the background. This is pure being. If we're going to use the word pure being, this is what it applies to, that limit, that horizon. And then in between that horizon and me, we have the carnal relation. We have the flesh of the world. And this is the openness and inexhaustibility of nearby things in an atmosphere of sensible world or history. And this is being, so not pure. This is what being is. It's that flesh, that carnal relation of engagement that takes place within this field between me and that horizon. But we make two mistakes, Merleau-Ponty says. We either deny this engagement by treating it as an illusion, by breaking it up into parts and trying to piece those parts together, which gives us a distorted picture, or we reify it as something a priori. We ground it in an external transcendental principle. And that is the exact same mistake, but at the other end of the spectrum. And so that's where I want to finish up today. Hopefully that made some sense. I feel like there was a little bit of repetition in there. There is it is Merleau-Ponty saying the same thing, basically, but in slightly different words, with a slightly different twist. But I do think at the same time, like I said at the beginning of the video, this does give us a clearer picture, I think, and it does throw up some fresh insights that perhaps weren't available if we just left it where it was. So anyway, thanks for watching. Hopefully it helped, and I will see you next time around.